I now call on the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr President. I rise to support this legislation on behalf of my party, the official opposition, the alternative government of this state and the oldest political party in the country, the Australian Labor Party. I commence by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respect as well to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to those First Peoples of New South Wales who are also present with us here today in this place, the Legislative Council of New South Wales, the first Parliament in Australia. It is fitting that here is where the parliamentary journey of this legislation commences. But as Minister Mitchell outlined, this is not where the story of this bill commences, as we have heard from the Minister in her second reading speech. The governmental journey commenced with the funding of the local community language revival in the early part of the first decade of this century by the former Labor government, leading to the Aboriginal Languages Policy of 2004 and the establishment of the Aboriginal Languages Research and Resource Centre. The development of the 5 Aboriginal language and culture nests, the network of communities connected to schools united by a connection to Aboriginal languages across 5 locations in this state. And I note from the Minister's contribution that we have had an increase in 1,000 students receiving education in Aboriginal languages just in the last year. That is not due to governmental action alone, but to a persistent desire of the first people of this land to know their language, despite all the hardship and dispossession that has been visited upon them by white European settlement. We should remember that over 250 Aboriginal Australian language groups were present on the continent at the time of European settlement in 1788. Today, only around 120 of those languages are still spoken, and many are at risk of being lost as elders pass away. Systematic attempts to deprive Aboriginal people of their language has meant that the link between generations of speakers has often been broken, so that many children had little or no knowledge of their traditional language. Their parents were partial speakers and their grandparents were the remaining few speakers of a language that as elders they alone could pass down to the next generation. Today we are seeing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across Australia speaking out about the need to strengthen their language. People in many communities are working hard to learn more about language and to ensure it is passed on to the next generations before it is too late. I note the contribution and presence today of many key language stakeholders, including the Aboriginal Land Council of New South Wales and too many others to list. I acknowledge the role of the former Minister, Leslie Williams, in bringing forward the concept of this legislation in 2016 and that of the present Minister for bringing it to the next stage. I also acknowledge the hard work of my colleague in the other place, the Shadow Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, David Harris MP, for his careful attention to this matter and his work with a range of language stakeholders in being part of this conversation and ensuring a cross-party approach is taken to these important matters, which should unite us and not divide us. Mr President, language is central to the human experience in every place on this planet. It's how we describe and try to understand our experiences of the world around us, of other people and ourselves. It's how we share that with each other and with the generations to come. We can see that in the songlines of the First Peoples, connecting people to place across time and generations, holding knowledge of country and its many stories, reflecting the special relationship of Aboriginal people with the land. Language is the gateway to culture. It is vital to developing and maintaining identity as a people and as individuals in that context. Without it, individuals are cut off, isolated, deprived of any sense of who they are. This is what white European settlement did or tried to do to the First Peoples of this land, to try and deprive them of their identity, commencing with silencing their language. How that can ever have seemed a kind or just course of action is today beyond all rational understanding. In those places where language has been lost, they experience a sense of grief and inadequacy due to the resulting loss of culture. And this is one of many things that has substantially contributed to the disempowerment and disadvantaging of Aboriginal people in New South Wales and Australia. This legislation is but one measure, although an important one, along the long road back from this tragic historic wrong. In one sense, Mr President, there is nothing in this legislation that could not be undertaken without there being a special act of Parliament. Each of these steps could be taken by administrative action alone. But the fact of this bill and its contents, the fact that the collected elected representatives of all of the people of this land acting together are consciously willing these courses of action, are committing to them in the context of all that was done to destroy Aboriginal language, culture and identity in the past. This small step today has important symbolic resonance. However, let it not be merely symbolic. Let us not, after the passage of this law, allow it to pass from conscious thought to become someone else's responsibility. Today, let each of us commit to be vigilant in support of this enterprise and to commit those forces in society that we all represent to do the same in the time that is to come. Now, the Minister pointed out that it's unusual in legislation to have a preamble, but for this particular piece of legislation it's entirely fitting. And I note the careful and diligent work of Dr Ray Kelly and others that has gone into this important aspect of what has both symbolic and practical meaning. And I won't read out the preamble as the Minister has. But as she has drawn our attention to, we must never forget that speaking in language was once forbidden. People were arrested for speaking language, children were removed from family and from country because of it. We should be conscious that by supporting Aboriginal people to know and to grow their language, reconnects them with their culture and identity. This will continue to assist in building resilience, which in turn will be another small step towards practical reconciliation between our peoples. The choice of language, the use of words to describe what we do or want to do, is so important. It really frames how those actions are perceived and influences how they are done. I note that the legislation does not seek to protect or to preserve Aboriginal languages, rejecting the language of past colonial injustice, but rather seeks to reawaken them, as if they were a strong flame which has been caused to die down to embers, but not extinguished, continuing to glow and to smoulder until, given oxygen and nourishment once more, to be given support, they grow back into their full glory once more. I note the last part of the preamble. It is acknowledged that Aboriginal persons are the custodians of Aboriginal languages and have the right to control their growth and nurturing. We must never forget the agency or the autonomy of Aboriginal people and the ownership they have and must have over their own language. This is the hope and the aspiration embodied in this legislation for the estimated 35 first languages and the more than 100 dialects of those languages spoken across the rich, wide lands of this state, which we all share. Thank you.